Shay Stongo, Sarah Barnett, Jahojifkados, Muskogee, Owes, Tahlequah, Legados. My name is Sarah Barnett. I'm a citizen of the Muskogee Nation. I am joining you from Tahlequah, Oklahoma. I want to welcome you to this session, which is part of the 48th Annual Symposium on the American Indian. This session is titled, How Indigenous Practices Help Us Heal Ourselves and Our Communities from Trauma. And this is with one of our keynote speakers, Dr. Tami DeCoteau. As you probably know, this session is one of many that are included in this year's virtual agenda. You can find the rest of the information on the symposium at our website at nsuok.edu/symposium. All of our sessions will be recorded and will be made available in the coming weeks. I want to point out and thank the American Indian Resource Center and the NetStar program for helping co-sponsor this session. And this is in collaboration with the NSU College of Education. So we're happy to have this collaborative effort to bring this presentation with Dr. DeCoteau to you today. A little bit about our speaker. Dr. DeCoteau obtained a doctorate degree in clinical psychology in 2003 from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln with specialization in the cognitive behavioral treatment of anxiety disorders for adults, adolescents, and children. She is a trust-based relational intervention or TBRI practitioner. TBRI is a therapeutic model that trains caregivers to provide effective support for at-risk children. She's trained in various other trauma treatment modalities, including EMDR, somatic processing, attachment intervention, NMT, and TF-CBT. Dr. DeCoteau has extensive experience working with patients who suffer from complex trauma, neurodevelopmental disorders, grief, anxiety, depression, and suicidal thinking. She has worked in a variety of outpatient settings with a diverse patient population, including veterans and Native Americans. This year, she was appointed by a member of the U.S. Congress to serve on the Commission on Native Children to help address challenges faced by Native children. Aside from clinical work, Dr. DeCoteau has given numerous lectures on how trauma impacts attachment and brain development, in-school strategies for working with traumatized children, and historical trauma. She's a longstanding member of the American Psychological Association, an enrolled member of the Mandan Hidatsa Arikara Nation, and descendant of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Dr. DeCoteau. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, everybody, and good afternoon. Really happy to have this next hour to talk to you about how Indigenous practices heal ourselves, and I'll talk a little bit about the science behind trauma, some of which you might be familiar with, and help draw some parallels between that and our Indigenous practices. This is always my favorite way to talk about trauma because it reminds everybody that as Indigenous people, we are not our historical trauma, that we are actually people with Indigenous knowledge and ways of understanding the world that we and other people can benefit from. And what I like to say is that trauma is the thing that interrupted our history. It is not our history, and it is the thing that makes it difficult for us to access our Indigenous knowledge, the things that are innate within us. So I want to start out this evening in along the lines of our Indigenous ways of being with telling a story, and then we'll get into some of the slides and the science, and then I want to end with the story. So for those of you who are familiar with trust-based relational intervention, you probably are familiar with Dr. Karen Purvis and Dr. David Cross, who are the co-founders, the creators of the trust-based relational intervention approach. And I do some contracting with their institute, and Dr. Purvis has since passed due to cancer, but I had an opportunity years ago to spend a week training with them, and I continued to work with Dr. Cross. And while I was there, she told me a story that has always resonated with me as such a good illustration of what trauma actually does to our nervous system and our ability to access who we really are. So Dr. Purvis was a bird lover, and she lived in Fort Worth, Texas, and she had bird feeders and bird nests and things all over her yard to attract different kinds of birds so she could do bird watching. And every year there was a certain type of bird or a bird family that would come and build a nest on her porch light. And she loved that because she could come home and she could see the little birds sticking their heads out of the nest as she went into her house for the evening. And then eventually they would lay their eggs and the eggs would hatch and she could watch these little birds grow and eventually fly the nest. And so this was sort of an annual event for her. And like all birds, this particular type of bird made a particular type of nest. Now, birds don't have to go to school to learn how to build their nest, right? They're born with this innate roadmap, this ability to instinctively know how to build their nest. And not just any nest, but a specific type of nest for that specific type of bird. They just know that. Just like we as humans have certain innate abilities. For instance, we have an innate ability to nurture our young. We have an innate ability to protect the clan or our family system, to provide for them. We know how to do these things innately. And then some of those things are culturally influenced as well. I remember as a first-time mother, when my infant was in his little car seat and we went to the restaurant for the first time and somebody sat down and bumped the table and the car seat rocked, how I instinctively flew across the table to grab and save that car seat from tipping. And I remember my husband and I chuckling about that and going, wow, that was weird. It was like some sort of internal drive that I didn't even have to think about that. Right? So we have this sort of built within us that's very innate and very reflective, just like a bird has the capacity to build a nest, a specific kind of nest that nurtures and keeps their young safe. One year, there was a traumatic event that happened in Dr. Purvis's neighborhood, and 2 doors down from her, there was an incident of domestic violence that involved a husband holding his wife hostage. And for about 24 hours while this was happening, there were police and there were news reporters and there were helicopters and there was all kinds of chaos and noise happening in her neighborhood near her yard. And then the police and a SWAT team infiltrated the neighborhood and came up onto her porch, and they were in her bushes, and all of this was happening for a period of about 1 day. And ultimately they apprehended the man, and his wife ended up being safe. But in the course of all of this chaos and noise and movement, somehow that bird nest on the light on her porch got knocked off. And over the next several days after the event, those birds came back and they rebuilt that nest. And she showed me a before and an after, and then the resolution of it. And the before picture looked like the normal nest, and the after picture, these birds came back and they rebuilt the nest, but they didn't build a nest at all. They built a pile of mud and string and sticks and weeds that didn't much resemble more than a pile of mud. And unfortunately, they laid their eggs in it that year, and it wasn't a safe nest. So she came home and she would find a broken egg on the porch. And then eventually a couple of those eggs made it to hatching stage. And then one day she came home and she found a dead baby bird on the porch. And the nest was not able to keep those baby birds safe. And somehow the chaos of that day, the trauma from that day, had created so much chaos in the bird's little nervous system and their innate abilities that it created too much noise, if you will, for them to access their innate knowledge to be able to build that nest properly. And they couldn't get to it. They built something else that wasn't safe at all. Eventually, she got tired of seeing this mess. She took that old nest and she threw it in the garbage, and time had passed. And so now the birds were back into their routine, back into their patterns of whatever they are in bird life. And they went back and they built the nest again. And this time they built the proper kind of nest. They built a safe nest that was able to safely contain and nurture their family. And I love that story because that is the best illustration of exactly what happens to us as human beings when we're exposed to trauma, that it takes our nervous system and it creates so much disarray and so much noise, if you will, that we cannot get to the parts of us that know how to live safely, that know how to be well, and know how to restabilize until we clear out that noise and reset our nervous systems. And one of the ways that we know how to do that, from watching our natural environment, from watching the animals in our environment, is through patterns and routines and rhythms. And our ancestors lived in rhythm, right? They were not rigid, linear people, but they were rhythmic people. And if you had a bird's eye view of a clanship, you would see that every movement of that clan had a rhythm, the way that water was fetched, the way that ceremony was conducted, the way that prayer was conducted. There was always a smooth flowing rhythm that was somehow connected with the rhythms of the universe around them, the rhythms of the season, the rhythms of the waters, the rhythms of the weather that day, the internal rhythms of a woman's body, and so on and so forth. And so we somehow knew as Indigenous people that creating a rhythm, sustaining a rhythm is what was healing and what kept us well. And that the connections that we made and the way that we lived were actually the best buffers against stress. They created our resiliency to trauma. So we'll talk a little bit later about how that was disrupted and what happened to us when it was disrupted. But what I want Indigenous people to understand is that all of those ways of being and that Indigenous knowledge for healing and wellness and understanding who we are and understanding how we fit into this world is still within us. And if we're not able to live that way, it's because the trauma is too noisy and too chaotic in our bodies. And we must heal ourselves first so that we can access those ways of being in order to then heal our communities. So let me start with my slides here. Give me just a second to share. All right, everybody see those slides okay? Can I get a thumbs up from somebody just so I know you got them? Perfect.
Yes.
Thank you. All right. So what is that noise? What is that noise for us? Well, it's lots of things, but first of all, it's historical trauma. Did we have traumatic incidents prior to colonizations? Probably. There were accidents, there was some warring, there were traumatic things that happened, but not in a mass genocidal way. And so our historical trauma is about this mass genocidal trauma. And we're not talking about small wars of tribes against tribes or this sort of things. We're talking about a government's attempt to entirely eliminate a group of people and their culture. And they did that through creating genocidal policies that are written into our government's policy manuals, and they're still there. We can still see them, right? So some people believe that this did not happen, but if you understand our American history and have had the ability to access some of the records, you know that indeed these policies were written to eliminate an entire group of people. And they did that in a number of ways, by colonizing them, dislocating them, oppressing them, killing them, starving them, and bringing them disease. And so there was this massive group trauma that was not only a threat to survival, but it was a disconnection from who they were as Indian people. And it was an attempt to destroy the fabric of the system that kept them in rhythm and maintained their health and built their resiliency. That historical trauma very interestingly now, again, here's a piece of the genetic research that is showing us that what we know as Indian people is again and again validated, because our epigenetic research now is showing us that indeed historical trauma has a way of impacting our DNA, transcribing how our DNA is expressed and passing on intergenerationally. And in animal studies, what they're finding is that trauma markers, which are actually remembered in the somatic system in the body, so they're remembered as sensory experiences, smells, sensations, colors, seasons, these kinds of things. They're remembered intracellularly in the DNA, in the somatic system. They're passed on intergenerationally for perhaps up to 14 generations in animal studies, right? So we know that as Indigenous people that we carry on the wounds of our ancestors when our ancestors haven't had the opportunity to adequately process through those. They get stored in the body and passed on. So intergenerationally, then what we see is that intergenerational, or what's sometimes referred to as transgenerational trauma, that's the passing down of trauma behaviors. Any group of people that has suffered the type of trauma that American Indian people has suffered has the same kind of behavioral patterns with violence, substance abuse, and the same kind of socioeconomic oppression, and is suffering in very similar ways that our American Indian people in the United States and Canada and so far. We can look at the Indigenous people of New Zealand, Australia, the Sami people of Norway, and they really all have similar situations, not because of their race, but because the behaviors are the typical types of expressions that we see when people suffer such mass group trauma. So in other words, we pathologize this, but really it's the human being's normal response to genocide and intergenerational trauma. Those behaviors then are passed on and create more trauma through inadequate parenting and so on and so forth. Violence and that pattern then gets repeated generation after generation. So that's what we're seeing today is sort of the mark of the historical trauma, some of the existing systems that continue to oppress Indian people create additional trauma, and then the passing on of the trauma behaviors, the repeating of those behaviors. Trauma, however, for the individual who is experiencing it knows that it feels like a betrayal in their own lives. They may not be able to pinpoint it and say, this is my trigger, this is what happened, but they know that something feels unbearable, something feels intolerable, it feels out of their control, and it overwhelms them. Trauma literally has the capacity to hijack the brain and take over control of the person's bodily and reflexive responses. It leaves an imprint in the brain, the body, the mind. Some would even say a spiritual wound or a spiritual imprint. The brain, this is just a really basic side image of the brain, but the point that I want to make here is that the brain has different areas that are primarily responsible for functioning. And I want to differentiate between what we refer to as the upstairs and downstairs brain. And some of you maybe have heard this language in trauma-informed care practices. And basically what we're talking about here is the downstairs brain is the bottom portion of the brain. It's the primitive part of the brain. It's the part of the brain that develops first at infancy. It's well wired, and it functions, it helps with our functions of mostly involuntary responses. So when an infant is born, the bottom part of their brain is very well wired for survival. The upper parts of the brain, not so much wired yet, but will rapidly build wiring, and it goes from the bottom up. So an infant can survive based on their reflexive responses to stimuli. Their heart obviously beats, their lungs work, their body regulates temperature to some degree, and then very rapidly they begin to develop in this area. So the downstairs part of the brain is also where our survival response exists. And the upstairs part of the brain does our thinking, our planning, our organization. It's where our creativity, our personality is at, and it's where our thinking brain is at. It's the part of the brain that helps us think through our emotional and reflexive responses and gives us control over those things. It's also the part of the brain that needs to be functioning in order for us to hold a job, manage our relationships, do well in school. A lot of you at this point have probably heard this term neuroplasticity. The way I like to describe neuroplasticity is to have you think of a glob or a ball of fresh Play-Doh, right? When we take that Play-Doh out of its jar, it's nice and fresh and easily malleable. That is like a young brain with a high level of neuroplasticity. So the younger we are, for the most part, the more neuroplasticity the brain has, the more it is quickly, rapidly building neuron connections, sort of like wiring. I like to think of it as wiring because it's easier. It's actually like chemical signaling. But if you think of this wiring is just growing and growing these connections, and the connections are being based on the experiences they have. So there's a term in the field called what fires together wires together. Every time we do something, we learn something, we have a new experience, we have a change in our environment, there are neurons that are firing for that experience. And every time they fire, they start to build a pathway. And at first the pathway is weak, and then we practice it more and we experience it more, and the pathway gets stronger and stronger and stronger. The neural connections get stronger. And the more times we practice that activity, that behavior, that experience, the stronger that pathway becomes until it's a superhighway. And when we have a superhighway, we actually have synapse development, which means that there's enough repetition and enough strength in that behavior that we don't have to be fully conscious in order to perform it. If any of you have ever had a bad habit and tried to break it, it's really hard because you have a super highway for that. In other words, you've done that thing so many times, it just comes without thinking. You do it without thinking, right? How many times do you put your seatbelt on and then look to see, is my seatbelt there, because you don't remember it? And then it's actually there, but you have no recollection because you have a synapse for that behavior. You can do it without being fully conscious. So that's how neuroplasticity works. And if you think again of that ball of Play-Doh, as the Play-Doh ages, as it gets exposed to air, it dries out and it's not as malleable, right? We can still mold it, but we got to work harder. And the older it gets, the harder it is to mold. That's like the aging brain. Sort of beyond the mid-20s, neuroplasticity slows way down, and it's just harder for us to learn new things, right? It's hard to teach an old dog new tricks because our brain does not build the neural connectivity as quickly and as easily as it does when the brain is younger. So the brain at a very young age, prior to the mid-20s, is super impressionable. And that counts for both positive and negative experiences. So think about a child who's grown up in a chaotic environment, who's had to learn adaptive responses like stealing or lying to survive. Those responses have been practiced over and over and over and over until they have synapse development. Now we get the child into a more stable environment. They're expected to do things like tell the truth. And they automatically reflexively lie when they're confronted. And if you ask them, why aren't you telling the truth? They'll say, I don't know, because they literally don't know. It becomes a reflexive action. Bedwetting, hoarding food, aggression. You can link almost any of these behaviors in that sort of way that they literally become reflexive. But the brain is super interesting because of the neural plasticity, especially in young children. We can rebuild it. So just like we built a neural pathway for a problematic behavior, we now can teach the child to build another new pathway for a behavior that's more helpful. In order to do that, you have to teach somebody how to, don't go down this road, recognize that reflex, stop it, back that truck up, go down this, let's practice this. The more we practice this new behavior, the more we create a synapse for that. And the more we resist the old behavior, the weaker this synapse becomes. It'll begin to atrophy just like a muscle. So here's the thing though. In a typical brain, it takes about 400 repetitions to build a synapse. 400. So we're talking about rebuilding the brain and teaching new behaviors. That's a lot of repetition, but there's a trick. And if you're an educator, if you're somebody who parents children from hard places, I want you to listen carefully. The trick is that if the child is moving their body and experiencing joy, it's about 12 repetitions for a synapse to develop. It is exponentially faster because joy disarms the amygdala. It turns on the thinking and learning part of the brain, and it optimizes their capacity to learn new things. So when we're looking at classrooms, we're looking at home environments, and we're thinking about, well, how do we rebuild brains of these individuals with trauma? I want to know, are your children having fun while they're learning, and are they moving their bodies? And the same is true for adults. When we're working with adults, are we actually moving through the actions and practicing the skills, and are we having fun doing it? Right? So keep that in mind. Let me move on to the next slide. The brain builds from the bottom up, right? From the downstairs, those more primitive, not less important, but they're perhaps less complex areas of the brain, to the more complex, sort of what we would call the higher level thinking. The point here is that if the downstairs parts of the brain do not have the optimal environment for development. So in other words, if the child is neglected and there's not appropriate stimulation for the downstairs parts of the brain, if the child has had a psychological or physical trauma early in life when that part of the brain was building, that part of the brain will be damaged. If the child's been exposed in utero to substances, those parts of the brain will be damaged. The upstairs parts of the brain are dependent on the downstairs part of the brain. It's sort of like the game Jenga. The foundation, the bottom part of the tower, has to be strong and solid in order for the top to be strong and solid. So what happens is we get children who are in maybe unstable homes in early childhood, but then maybe even by first grade, second grade, they get into a stable home and they have all the stimulation and support that they need, but they still continue to struggle with learning and behavior and emotional regulation, because those parts of the brain can't function until we go back and fix and provide the stimulation to the downstairs parts of the brain. So how do we do that? So this chart shows the basic 4 regions of the brain, from the brainstem to the purple area, which is the upstairs brain. And the brain develops from the bottom up. And again, neuroplasticity means that there is the most capacity for that part of the brain to build at this specific period of time. So let me give you an example. Language acquisition. For those of you like myself who tried to learn a language later in life, I took 5.5 years of Spanish in high school and college. I still can't speak it. I can sort of read it and hear it, but I still can't speak it, because language acquisition, the neuroplasticity for language acquisition, peaks in early childhood in those preschool years. So that is the best time to build that capacity. Once that window of opportunity closes, you can still build your neural pathway for that skill, but it's much harder and you may not be able to fully acquire it. So what I want you to see in this chart is the critical period, this here in the middle. And I want you to see the age range goes up. It starts in utero and it stops at age 6. So by age 6, the neuroplasticity for many human functions is the peak period, the critical period for building those ends about age 6. What that means is after age 6, we can still rebuild those functions, but it takes more time and more repetition, which means more patience and more time on our end. And what does that mean for educators? What does that mean for adults, right? Each of these areas, in order for development to happen in a healthy way, requires certain kind of experiences. And the keys to those experiences has to do with rhythmic pattern input and engaged caregiving and storytelling. So here's the part that really, where the science really overlaps with what we know in our Indigenous beliefs and traditions, is that all of our healing ceremonies, all of our religion, all of our ways of being involved this type of rhythmic patterned input. Our songs, our dances, our movements, and most of those involve both left-right stimulation to the body, which we call bilateral stimulation or dual attention stimulation. And it has to do with helping. We use this actually as a technique in trauma resolution, where we're helping the body and the brain integrate the trauma with the rest of the memory system, so that the upstairs parts of the brain can help manage the emotional parts of the brain. And Native people must have known something about this. We didn't call ourselves scientists, and we didn't call ourselves medical doctors, but in fact, we were those things in many ways. And we must have known something about the nervous system. And whether we understood it in the scientific ways we understand it now or not doesn't matter, because we knew what worked for healing and we knew what worked for managing stress, because our entire culture surrounds these concepts. So now a lot of the treatment techniques are actually referring back to Indigenous practices, Indigenous drumming, Indigenous music and singing, and the types of caregiving and interaction that Indigenous people practiced years ago, and to some extent still practice today, are the things that are being recommended for healing and restoring brain functioning in children and adults who have suffered trauma. It's extremely validated for Indian people to be able to now live in a new era where we're beginning to hear that perhaps we had it right all along, right? Perhaps what we've been told was illegal and, you know, pagan and whatever else term was used to describe those things. We now have science to say, actually, that was accurate. And we can look towards our Indigenous practices for ways of healing now. Dr. Cross, the co-founder of TBRI, has worked with me on a couple projects of building trauma-informed tribal communities. And in a couple years ago, we were working with a tribe down south, and really sincerely, if you've ever seen him, he's this big, huge, tall, in his younger days, rugby player, white guy. And he just stood up and he said to the Indigenous tribal people, he said, you know, I want this healing to happen for your community because it's good for you and I want good things for you. But then he said, I want this to work for me also. Like, I got skin in this game, because what I'm learning about you all is that you have ways of healing that actually will benefit me and my people. And we need to know about that. And that was really, it sort of struck me as like, wow, you're right. Like, that's the first time I've heard a non-Indian person say, hey, you guys can help us heal. Once we help you heal, then will you please turn around and help us heal, because we have our own healing to do. So let me move on to talking about attachment, because relationships and attachment are central to Native culture. Attachment is actually a system in the brain. It's a part of the brain that develops to help the infant feel safe and secure. So baby cries, baby's needs are responded to, baby's cared for, baby's fed, baby's kept warm, baby's soothed and rocked, and we give baby what baby needs, then baby learns that they're important, that their world is safe, that they're loved. They begin to understand themselves. They begin to understand other people. It's this entire part of the brain that helps them understand emotions, helps them regulate emotions, and helps them understand other people's emotions. This is the stuff of life. This is what life and meaning is based on, because meaning in life is really about understanding emotion, understanding self, having meaningful relationships. And so if this part of the brain does not get the proper caregiving, then this part of the brain does not properly develop and cannot perform these really necessary functions. This is the part of the brain that forms the basis for success later in life. I often say, you can be somebody with a really high IQ, but if you can't do relationships and you can't manage your own emotions and understand other people's emotions, then you're really going to struggle in life. But you could be somebody with a really low IQ, and if you can do those things, you're going to be just fine. Like, this is the stuff of life. And so that's the importance of this part of the brain, and the importance of being properly nurtured, not just physically cared for, but really properly attuned to, where the parent knows what the child needs and is able to tune to that need and provide that. What is comfort, pleasure, calm and balanced attuned interaction for an infant? It's rocking and humming and feeding and all the funny noises and face-to-face stuff we do with babies. when they're upset, because babies can't calm themselves. They're not born with the ability to do that. And the way that they calm themselves is through co-regulation. So when a caregiver engages with them, a caregiver's calm in their own body and is soothing the infant will regulate with that caregiver. If you've ever seen a stressed out caregiver, a stressed out mom or a stressed out young dad try to calm their infant, you know that it doesn't work, that parent's agitated, the baby gets more agitated. The parent gets more agitated, the baby gets more agitated. And it's just like this vicious cycle. And that's because baby can't regulate if parent isn't regulated in their body. So through this interaction of co-regulation, the baby will eventually develop the ability to regulate themselves. If this doesn't happen, now we have an older child and an adult who cannot regulate their own emotions. The other thing that they cannot do is they cannot respond properly to what we call mirror neurons. So if I'm a teacher, for instance, and I come into work one day and I'm smiling, but on the inside, I'm a mess because maybe I had something stressful happen to me in the morning and I'm still upset about that. And it has nothing to do with my students, but my nervous system is not okay, but I'm trying really hard to look okay. If I can make a connection with a student, their mirror neurons in their brain will pick up my neurons, and my neurons are firing off stress neurons. And their mirror neurons will begin to fire off stress neurons. Will connect together. And I can actually dysregulate that student because my own body is dysregulated. The same is true if I come and there's a dysregulated student and I can keep my body feeling calm, I can actually connect with that student and help that student regulate. That's how our brains work. In children whose attachment brains have not properly developed, their mirror neurons don't properly work. And what happens is they have a hard time reading the cues of other people, and they tend to perceive threat where there is none, or they tend to over perceive threat. So now we see this in the adult population as well, where they're feeling like we're attacking us, or they're acting in a defensive way because they're getting a signal in their body that says, you're under threat, you're in danger, respond appropriately. They shut down, they're aggressive, they make accusations because they are unable to properly read our signals. Again, all hope is not lost because we can rebuild that kind of deficit in the brain through relationship intervention. So mirror neurons get broken when there's relationship trauma, when a person has been hurt, especially a child, by somebody who was supposed to keep them safe. The only appropriate intervention for relational trauma is a relationally based intervention. We hear a lot about the amygdala. What I want to remind everybody about with the amygdala is that the amygdala is the boss of you. So once the amygdala is full on fire, I'm not talking about a spark in the forest, I'm talking about the forest is on fire. It is on fire. It will hijack the entire brain. The thinking parts of the brain, the self-control parts of the brain actually go black. They go offline. And the person's amygdala and downstairs survival brain is on fire. And all that they can do at that point is simply react defensively, whether that be a freeze or a fight-flight response. And they can't make sense of their environment. So the amygdala will tell them there's threat and to respond accordingly. The part of the brain that says, hey, the thing that you're afraid of and that you're reacting to is actually something in your past. The sequencing part of the brain goes offline. So they can't tell. The brain can't tell the body, hey, you're safe right now. You're just reacting to something in the past. All they know is they're reacting right now. They feel afraid right now. And if you're standing in front of them, it's your fault. So until the person learns how to calm themselves, and the way that we do that is we develop the upstairs brain, and we develop the upstairs brain capacity to override the amygdala response and pull them back into upstairs brain thinking so that they can make sense of their world, they can understand what's going on. And then through therapy, we can integrate back into the brain and the body, the system that says, hey, this was in your past and you're actually safe right now. The body has a memory system of its own. So when somebody experiences a trauma, that trauma experience sends a visceral sensation into our body. Our emotions are visceral, right? Sadness feels a certain way in your body. Anger feels a certain way in your body. Excitement produces a certain sensation in the body. And that information travels through this nervous system. The nervous system branches and connects with organs. And that's why we have feelings like heartbreak. That's why we have a heaviness in our chest. That's why we have butterflies in our stomach. We literally experience our emotions as sensations in our body, and this body remembers the sensations, just like our brain remembers, has a recollection of a picture of something. Our body has a recollection of the sensation. So if the person was traumatized and during the trauma there was a smell of whiskey, the body remembers the sensation of whiskey. And 20 years later, if they haven't had trauma resolution, if they come across that same smell, the amygdala will fire off a signal and warn them and say there is danger. And the body will reproduce the same sensations they felt at the time of that trauma, but they probably won't have the ability to remember what that trauma was about at that moment. Most people who are triggered by sensory input like that, and they do
I think I might be able to bring some treats.
Oops, somebody has their mic on. Could you check and shut it off, please? Thank you. But I would love some treats if you can send them this way. So the signal goes into the body, fires off those same sensations, and the individual doesn't understand why they're feeling that way. In order for us to do the thinking, planning, overriding the amygdala system, we have to be in a calm state. The upstairs brain does not work adequately unless we are calm. But if our attachment brain isn't properly nourished and developed, then we cannot self-regulate. So most people with trauma exist here in vigilance or alarm. That's where they exist all the time, right? I could be driving to work in the morning and get in a near accident. I'm calm. I immediately go into alarm. Then I realize I'm safe. In a few moments, I can calm myself and pull myself back up into this purple area, and I'm good. Somebody with trauma cannot do that with a dysfunctional nervous system. They don't have the capacity to do that. They live in vigilance and alarm, and it's a hair trigger into a full-on fear response, and they can't pull themselves back up to calm. You don't have to exist here for very long to know that you cannot function here and it feels really bad. You can't sleep here because sleep is all about relaxation, and you can't relax in vigilance, alarm, or fear. And so folks, this is our substance abusing population. The majority of people who are substance abusing because they do not have the capacity to self-regulate, either because of their own personal trauma or because of ancestral trauma, and they've inherited a dysfunctional nervous system. And without the ability to self-regulate, then they only have the capacity to look for something external to regulate them so that they can get some relief. So what we're doing in our trauma-informed approaches is helping the person get in the upstairs brain, stay in the upstairs brain, and we're using strategies to prevent them from going to the downstairs brain, recognizing what trauma behaviors look like so that when they get into the downstairs brain, we can help them get out as quickly as possible. That's what the strategies, that's the science that the strategies are all based on. Most of you at this point are familiar with the Asus studies, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. On the left, what you see is the pyramid for the general population. And on the right, what you see is the hypothetical pyramid for the American Indian population. And as you see, there's 2 additional layers to that pyramid that involve the historical trauma and then our current social context of that historical trauma. So when we're working with Indigenous people, if we are Indigenous people, we have to recognize that our trauma is more complex. It goes deeper. And we're not that far away from it. People think that these things happened several hundred generations ago. They're still happening today. They happened one generation ago. The boarding school era was, for me and my family, one generation. I am the child of a boarding school survivor. This was not hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So this idea, now that we know how trauma stores in the body, how it passes on at intergenerational, this idea that, well, you just get over it. It's over. It didn't happen to you. Just move on. It just doesn't hold up in the science. That's not how trauma works in the body. People ask me all the time, is there one sort of genocidal policy that was the most detrimental? And I say, absolutely, in my opinion, especially as a relational therapist, it was this era, the boarding school era. And the reason for that is what I touched on earlier. Native children have multiple attachments. They have attachments to their clanship, and the relationships within the clanship are very delineated and very meaningful. And they have multiple meaningful attachments. But the attachments weren't just to their clan members, their family. The attachments were also to their universe. They had an attachment to their language, their culture, their way of being. They had an attachment to their land. Land and place of origin is extremely important, because as Indigenous people, that's where our culture is. It's in the land. Our language and traditions are in the land, and our ancestors are in the land. When we have a ceremony in a location, the energy from that ceremony continues to exist for our healing even after the ceremony ends. And so we had all these multiple connections that were connected to our place and our home. And when our ancestors were taken from our homes and placed in these institutions, every single one of those attachments that created resiliency, that buffered them from trauma, were broken. And then they were placed in institutions where they were not allowed to have connections, not even with siblings. And they were abused and treated with corporal punishment. These are children that came out of the system, the ones who survived, with extremely complex trauma. And without the internal regulators that a person who had grown up in a healthy environment would have. And so they had no other way to be except to have this dysfunctional, dysregulated nervous system. And what they learned in these institutions was how to be abusive, was how to hurt one another. And they came out of that not knowing who they were, not knowing how to regulate, not knowing how to create meaning in their lives, and only knowing how to be aggressive. And they went back to their communities, and so began now our intergenerational trauma of violence and abuse that we see. Until we heal this phase of our trauma, we will struggle to heal the violence and child abuse in our communities. So how do we do that? Well, again, all of the research points exactly to our Indigenous ways. We start by first healing the body, and we re-regulate the nervous system. We reset it, we find harmony again, and we do it through mindfulness practices, movement, especially movement that is rhythmic and involves both left, right side of the body, rhythmic sound, rhythmic types of breathing that we find in meditation and prayer and ceremony. We do it by nurturing ourselves with the right kind of cleansing, hydration, and nutritional food, and adequate amounts of sleep. When in our Indigenous ways, we had ways when somebody was hurting of helping them suspend their responsibilities, and the community would care for them and bring them their food and their water so they could rest their bodies. So we have these ways, and every single tribal community I go to, when I talk about these things, somebody in the audience says, we have ways like that in our tribal community, and here's what we call them, and here's how we do them. So while they're different from tribe to tribe, the basis of them is the same. We also do that by supporting the person, by making connections, by sharing power, by, we have this very sort of democratic way of being where everybody's voice was heard, where we talked about an issue until the issue was resolved. Sometimes that was days, and we our practices involved us to come together to get something done. On the bottom right, what you see is actually a group of youth down on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation harvesting the very sacred tree that will be used in Sundance. And some of these youth could be called delinquents, but when it's time for a ceremony like this, they all come together and they all work together in the most respectful way. It's fascinating to see how this happens. So I want to end by telling you a story again about, and this is a story that one of my elders told me years ago when I was still an adolescent and before I was ever really even thinking of a specialization in trauma. You know how life sometimes is understood in reverse. And I didn't know that this was going to be such a meaningful story until I became a therapist who was specializing in trauma and one day had an epiphany and said, oh, that's what they were talking about. But the story goes like this. This person said to me, we had traumatic incidents happen when our ancestors in the old days, and we had ways of healing them. We had targeted intervention from trauma. And here's an example this person said. They said, say a warrior went out on a war party, right? And war parties often were about stealing horses, not killing one another, but perhaps something traumatic happened. And those individuals would come back, and the warrior who it happened to would gather in front of the rest of the clan and tell their story. They would describe what happened. So there is our cognitive processing and our verbal, our conversation about it, our ability to talk about what happened. Two components of trauma resolution as we know them today. They would tell the story. Everybody would listen. Somebody who saw it would happen would stand up and say, I saw that happen, and what that person said is true. It happened the way they said. Atonement and truth value. We heard what you said. We give you voice. You had the ability to process it. Now we believe you. We believe what you say is true. Then, and during all of this, there would be rhythmic sound, drumming, rattle, what have you. There would be prayer. There might be some singing or chanting. And the warrior would actually tell the story. They would act it out. And they would act it out. This is where some of our Indigenous dances or the dances that you see at powwows come from. They would actually act out what happened. So they would be moving their body in this very left-right fashion, which is how we integrate and process out trauma today. And then if the warriors would be given a name, right, to reflect what happened. The name would be changed. They would be given a name to reflect the meaning of what happened. Maybe their war horse would have paintings that reflected the story. If the warrior had a spouse, the spouse then would paint maybe the canvas on the teepee to tell the story of what happened. So then all of that traumatic incident became part of the clan's history and the warrior's history and the family's history in a very meaningful way. Those are all the components of trauma resolution as we know them to be effective today, present right there in that Indigenous practice. And again, every time I go to a tribal community and I tell that story, somebody tells me, we have a ceremony just like that. And we do it this way, and it's called this. I have yet to be at a tribal community that hasn't said that. So we know how to heal ourselves. And we struggle to do that because it's so difficult for us to access our knowledge and our wisdom when we have so much traumatic noise. We get distracted and we have a hard time healing ourselves sometimes because of our emphasis on the community. And some Indian people feel like it's selfish to heal self before you heal others. But given what we've been through, we must first realign our internal selves so that we then can help realign our communities. I have time for just a couple of questions. I don't want to keep anybody beyond their time. I'm sure you've all had a long day, but if you have a couple of questions you want to put in the chat, I can read through those quick.
I think there is one question about how can a person who's been disconnected from their community, language, and homeland find healing?
Yeah, that's a really good question and not the first time I've been asked that. So I would say do what you can to reconnect with your tribal people. And most Indigenous communities, in my experiences, are ultimately open to that. They're not, there may be a little bit of, you know, wanting to get to know what you're actually about and finding out if you're sincere, but, you know, going to powwows, connecting with people, attending events, going to rodeos, basketball games. And if that's not available, connecting with other Indigenous people, we accept that, we invite that, because we understand how hard it can be and how fragmented we are because of the colonization. And the other thing is that remember that the healing and the energy from ceremonies and our ancestors still exist in our land base. So find the location of your homeland and go there and be there and absorb that energy. Even if you're not involved in ceremony or interacting with people, that land still holds our Indigenous ways and our Indigenous ceremonies. And the land itself is healing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. DeCoteau. I really enjoyed your presentation. We have many educators or future educators here on the line with us, and so that I know that that will be so very important for them to take with them. I want to invite everyone to follow that link. So go ahead and copy and paste the link to our survey into your browser, so that once we close down this meeting, you can still complete that evaluation. At the end of that evaluation will be an opportunity to enter your name and contact information to enter a drawing to win some resources that the NetStar and our College of Education will be providing. And these are resources for trauma-informed practice, specifically for educators. So we do want you to be able to take some things that can help you apply what Dr. DeCoteau has talked about here today. And I also want to remind you that tomorrow, or Friday rather, at noon, we'll have Dr. Daryl Tonema also as a keynote speaker, sponsored by this same group, who will speak more about this trauma-informed practice. And I believe his title is From Dealing to Healing. So thank you so much. We are going to have to stop now because we are starting another session that starts at 5 o'clock. So thank you so much again, Dr. DeCoteau. Enjoyed your presentation, and thank you everyone for joining us. Mudo.